Hey guys, we hope you like this video. We're having so much fun making this podcast and we want more people to hear about it. So please make sure to subscribe, share this with your friends, like our videos, comment on them. We want to hear from you.
Okay. In linguistics, this is something that people have studied. It's commonly taught to people who are linguistics majors, but there's this idea that there's a cooperative principle when people communicate with each other. We have certain expectations of how people will communicate with us. And one linguist or philosopher of language identified some maxims that he said people follow, and we expect that people follow when they communicate with others. They're known as the Gricean Maxims because the guy's last name is Grice, and so they're called the Gricean Maxims, sometimes called the conversational maxims. And again, we assume that people follow these when they're adhering to the cooperative principle. These consist of quantity, quality, relation, and manner. Quantity is that you say as much as is appropriate. You don't overdo it and you don't underdo it. Quality is that you need to be truthful. You don't just repeat things that you don't know to be true. Or if you do, you at least let people know about the relative reliability of what you're saying. Relation, also called relevance, is that we expect people to tell us things that are relevant. And manner involves such things as being clear, avoiding ambiguity, being orderly. You know, if somebody gives me a recipe, I expect that it's in the order of what procedures I follow. You don't tell them to put it in the oven and then beat in 3 eggs. So the cake you're making, you first have certain steps you do before you put it in the oven. We expect people to tell you the order in which you do things. We expect them to be clear and that sort of thing. That follows manner. So you have quantity, quality, relation, and manner. And from our expectations about how people adhere to these, we interpret implicatures in what they say. And so an example of an implicature that grows out of one of the Gricean maxims, and the implicatures grow out of our expectations about how those maxims are followed. Here's an example. If I asked my daughter, how are you getting home tonight? Let's say she's going to a dance with, some friends, and I say, how are you getting home tonight? And she says, Susie has a car. I assume that what she's telling me about Susie has a car is related, it's relevant to what I asked her. I have to be able to assume that. Our communication would break down if we couldn't assume that what people are telling us is somehow relevant. So when she says Susie has a car, I understand that to be an answer to how she's getting home.
Right.
Susie must be her friend. Maybe I know that Susie's her friend. She didn't tell me Susie's driving her home, but if I assume that she's following the maxim of relation, I think, okay, she's telling me how she's getting home. Susie must be driving her home. Now, again, implicatures, that's an implicature that Susie is driving her home. Even though she didn't actually say that, it's an implicature.
Yeah.
From the assumption that what she said is somehow relevant or related. Implicatures then come from our expectations that people follow the maxims. Now, they can also come from violations to the maxims if they are clearly signaled and people can be expected to figure out the intended meaning. Now, you can't just violate the maxims. You have to clearly signal the violation. And if people know that you've clearly signaled the violation, they can figure out intended meaning, then they're still adhering to the cooperative principle, and we get the intended implicature.
Yeah.
An example of a violation is like a letter of recommendation. If you send a letter of recommendation for somebody, you've been asked to send a letter of recommendation for somebody to get a job, maybe as a professor, and your letter is extremely short. Maybe the person only wrote, he's worked for us for a year and he's a nice guy. And that's all you say. The implicature is that don't hire this guy. He's not very good. They didn't actually say that, but by vastly, so obviously violating the maxim of quantity, you've signaled that this is probably not the best candidate. Yeah.
You've seen examples of that. Are there examples of that? People.
I know of someone who saw a pretty extreme example of this, and uh, it was a professor of mine where I studied who said that they were trying to signal to somebody. And, in an era of lawsuits and things, you don't want to say something negative, so sometimes you convey certain things through implicature, but the other people that they were, or the person they were trying to give these implicatures to didn't pick up on it, hired the person, and I guess it didn't work out.
Oh, no.
So well. But anyway, now what if the person had added to the fact that he worked for us for about a year and he's a nice guy? What if they'd added things like, and he has a nice garden, and he has several children? Now, this is what we put in the letter. If this were put in the letter for somebody applying for a job, it also violates the relation maxim.
Right.
I'm trying to get a letter of recommendation about this guy's abilities as a professor, and you're telling me about a garden and about his children. So then you say, well, why would somebody put that in the letter, a very short letter, and what is there is sort of irrelevant if they can say nice things about him that are related to the job. The fact that they don't say the nice things that are related to the job seems like a clear departure, clearly signaled violation of the Gricean Maxims. They're probably trying to tell us, don't hire him. When people use sarcasm, nobody accuses them of lying, because usually it's clearly signaled that they're violating the maxim of quality. It's such an obvious violation that you're like, you feel like, oh, okay, I think they're trying to say this person is the opposite of what they're saying. So we convey implicatures through how we follow the maxims, but sometimes we convey implicatures about clearly signaled violations of the maxims as well. And then we, of course, get humor from violations that aren't clearly signaled and lead to misunderstandings. And Hollywood has built film scenes around this in comedies and other things. The example that very quickly comes to mind for me is one of the Pink Panther movies, Chief Inspector Clouseau, who's a bumbling detective, and there's a lot of potential comedy and all that. But in one scene, he goes into a sort of hotel, and he sees a clerk at the front desk, and there's also a little dog in the lobby, and he looks at the dog, he looks back at the clerk, and he says, "Does your dog bite?" And the clerk says, "No." And so Inspector Clouseau, leans over to pet the dog. He goes, "Nice doggy." And as he leans down to pet the dog jumps up and starts to rip his hand off. And Clouseau jumps back, and he looks at the clerk and says, "I thought you said your dog doesn't bite." And the man says, "That's not my dog." Now, in a situation like that, we would expect, and this example is reported, I think, in Deborah Aaron's a book she's written about humor and language. But we would expect that if somebody asks about whether a dog bites, and they're clearly asking because they're going to approach the dog, and they ask if our dog bites. If it's not our dog, we need to say so.
Right.
If we're following the maxim of quantity, where you have to say as much as is necessary, he clearly left out some important information that would make a difference. And everybody recognizes that, and that's why they see humor in it, because it's such a violation. It wasn't clearly signaled, but it's such a violation that leads to that sort of problem. Another quick example here is a joke I saw where somebody said they fell off a 60-foot ladder that day, and the other person said, "Oh my goodness, are you okay?" And the first person said, "Oh yeah, I fell off the first rung of the ladder." And so then, it's like, that seems like an obvious, it's not clearly signaled, but it's a violation of the relation maxim. First of all, why do you even bring up the story? Who cares if you fell from the first rung of a ladder? And second of all, what difference does it make that it was a 60-foot ladder if you fell off the very bottom? The fact that you mention that makes them think that you fell off the top of the ladder or very far up the ladder. And then, of course, so sometimes you get humor from the way people go against our normal expectations. But sometimes we can get it from a socially awkward use of implicature. Remember, those are implicatures. When you say, I fell off a 60-foot ladder, people assume from the mentioning that you fell from quite high up.
Right.
The implicature is that you did so. And when the man told Clouseau no to the question, does your dog bite? The implicature is that is the man's dog that he's responding to. Otherwise, he should have said something. Well, here's one where somebody doesn't maybe violate the expected sort of implicature, but it's still an awkward use of an implicature. You get the meaning, from this. But Bob Newhart had a funny line. He was an older comedian, had a funny line where he said, he said, I don't like country music, but I don't mean to denigrate those who do. And then he said, for those who like country music, denigrate means to criticize or put down. And the fact that he would include the definition for those people, denigrate for those people who would like country music, it carries the implicature that they're not very smart.
Right.
Okay, which he just finished saying he doesn't mean to denigrate those who do. Well, it's not a clearly signaled violation of one of the maxims. It conveys an implicature. It's just funny, I think, because it's a sort of awkward way of communicating with people.
Right.
So I don't know. You asked about implicatures, and there, in a nutshell, is probably. I don't know if you want to know more.
No, that's
Covers. I think
it's a great story. That's great.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that.
And I should say, it illustrates how a knowledge of these kinds of things could help somebody who wanted to maybe generate humor. It would give them ideas, because
Absolutely.
you could work with the different maxims. You know what the maxims are. You know how these things can be created, and it could possibly give you some ideas for how to artfully manipulate implicatures and those kinds of conversational maxims that I've mentioned.
Right. This is something I love about, from what I've studied about linguistics, just it's something that we all participate in, but then to kind of uncover it and see what's actually going on. And then, as you say, to be able to kind of have some control over that and potentially manipulate the way you're using language for certain effects. I love that about linguistics, about studying language.
It's pretty fun when you get
Yeah, it's
inside those things.